So why is the Center for the Edge at Deloitte interested in this? One, we see the maker movement to be, it reflects some of the disruptive patterns that we see across in many other places. So the economic landscape is shifting in a very fast way. We can connect ideas, people, across geographic boundaries faster than ever before. It democratizes what we can do. We can all have an impact. Makers can have an impact today than they could ever before. You can create viable businesses, as you heard from Shoplucker and all that. You can start civic movements. You can ignite and inspire a generation. You will help how we identify ourselves as creators more than consumers. And that's of interest to us. Lynn, do you want to explain what you do at IFGF?
Yeah, so I'm from a research group called the Institute for the Future, which is kind of a bit of a funny name, but we are a nonprofit group in Palo Alto. We've been around for 46 years, so we have managed to outlive our forecasts several times over. And I'm a cultural anthropologist. So what we do at the Institute is we look at the way technology is changing the way that we work, the way that we learn, the way that we eat, the way that we do business. And so we've been looking at the maker movement for the past really 8 or 9 years and watching it spread around the globe and really tap into something really profound, I think, that's happening. So as a cultural anthropologist, I ask questions like, what is it about the maker movement that is drawing so many people in? Are there other parts of life that are perhaps missing, that we're missing some of the things that we get in making? And the broader questions also that Duleesha is asking about, what does it mean for the way that we do business, for our economy, for our schools? So those are some of the things that Institute for the Future is looking at.
Okay, I'm Richard Kelly. And for the last, I guess, 6 years, I've been living in Shanghai. I was running IDO China for a bunch of years. And about a year ago, I bailed out and joined Li & Fung, which is a large Hong Kong Chinese family business that is a sourcing company. And so if you'd imagine what we do, we don't own any factories and we don't any retail at the other end, but everything in between, we sort of run and orchestrate. And so as we begin to look at the future of making things and where that's what's happening around the world, whether it's the nature of jobs, whether it's where it happens, should manufacturing come back to the US, this topic is very central to us. And so we're constantly in the mode of trying to figure out whether it's 3D printing, whether it's big data, trying to think about and ways to engage different communities in what that future might look like. And so less about research and more about doing stuff. And so my background, I guess, in anthropology like Lyn's and designing is in that mode of shifting us as a company back to a sense of making stuff again. So.
Great, so we're going to run through our 3 topics, identity, scale, and geography. We'll present each one, so each one of us has taken to present one of them, and then we move on to the next. So I want to give a hat tip here to John from Enable. This was a conversation we had about the $50 prosthetic. Some of you might have heard of it. And this is one of many examples that it changes our identity. So when you can create things for much cheaper and also have the same functionality, if not better functionality, what does that mean? In the case of prosthetics, you don't just need to replicate what you could do. You could now incorporate art and tinkering into that. Why not have an art piece as a prosthetic? Why stop for just functionality? And why not go for bionic appendages? Why stop at doing what you could do as a human being? As things get cheaper, you can start doing that. You can start incorporating your identity into what you create. So if you think of identity today, it's a lot about what you consume. That's how we project ourselves. How, where we live, how we dress, what car we drive. But if you look around us, and counter to what Dale said, what's identity shifting to? Cupcakes. It's what you create. We see identity shifting in many ways from what you consume to what you create. And this is not just in making. If you think of blogging, everyone's blogging, that's part of your identity. You're not just a passive consumer of information. You put out information as well. If you think of software coding, GitHub is where all the software coders show their chops. They're remixing. Anything to do with art, music, you're remixing all these things. Now, what does any of this have to do with manufacturing? Well, it comes to the key point. Anything that gets manufactured is based on the fact that somewhere, someone down the line is going to buy it. So if we shift how we perceive ourselves, our identity, and what we want to buy, it has implications all the way up to, well, what should anyone manufacture? So I'd posit two things for my colleagues here to speak to and for you guys to think about. 10 years out, I believe that there will be mass manufacturing, but it'll be mostly components and sub-assembled parts. It will be the raw materials. Assembly of the final materials will be happening at a local level, so it'll draw a lot more small, sustainable local businesses, or done by us, where we could buy the parts and put it together. So that has implications for manufacturing. The second is going along with the sustainable movement. We don't want to just buy stuff. We want to upcycle. We want to recycle. So we'll actually buy less things overall. And that means less things will get manufactured overall. And that too has implications for manufacturing. So my questions to my colleagues, do you think identity actually will drive enough chain in the global manufacturing chain? And do you think this goes across boundaries? I mean, would you see this in China, India, in Africa, and everywhere else?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm very interested in, my grandfather was a steel worker in Pittsburgh. And my mother then was raised to think of education as a way out of working in a factory. And one of the things I think that's very interesting about making, especially electronics and things that use complex processes and materials, that kind of making, the kind of making that we just saw with Steve was talking about, is that there's a kind of coming back around to an identity which is closer to maybe what my grandfather used to do, those kinds of things. Thinking of yourself as a manufacturer. I think this is a really profound shift. I think that, and our job is to think in 2025, what might that look like? I'm curious to hear from you guys if you see this happening. I know many of the people at the fair are interested in this kind of thing. And I think when we go around the world and we look at what's happening with the maker movement in places like China or Brazil, Mexico City has a very active maker movement. One of the questions is, how do you integrate people who are actually blue-collar workers who are doing this for a job? How do we integrate them into the maker movement and kind of bring those two identities, those kinds of identities together? Those are some of the, I think, interesting questions to ask.
I mean, I'm just looking at the cupcakes. Either they're here or they're driving around or riding around. And so I'm sort of intrigued about when you talk about identity. It's sort of a industry term versus nobody uses the word identity usually. So, and so I'm sort of fascinated about the sort of notion that whether it's I see a lot of discussions about me generation versus we generation and all those kinds of things. I'm sort of intrigued about the notion that that the language that everybody uses now about manufacturing is still very industrial, and it's not language of the people. And if the maker movement really takes off, and we're watching it in Shanghai and in Shenzhen and a bunch of other places around the world, so it becomes much more about individuals. So it becomes about me, but ultimately everyone the planet becomes much smaller, and so the fact that you're a me maker, you have this huge marketplace. And so the language that we used to have and the language we have to describe everything doesn't really apply anymore. And so if that doesn't apply, then your whole relationship between you and that outside world and what my identity is going to shift. So whether people will see themselves as individual manufacturers, I don't know, but it will be in 2025. I think it's going to shift.
Okay. Lynn, do you want to take the next one?
Sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about scale. And if any of you are using an iPad, an iPod Touch, an iPhone, if you have in the past years played on an Xbox or a PlayStation or used a Nokia phone or a BlackBerry, then you have touched products that are made by Foxconn. And Foxconn is the Taiwanese technology giant, the largest contract electronics manufacturer in the world. They have 1.3 million workers. They have factories all over the globe. And if you've heard of Foxconn, you've probably heard some of the negative things about them. You may have heard about strikes, worker strikes, about labor conditions. You may have heard about the string of suicides that happened in 2012 in southern China. And all of those, of course, are really important issues when we're thinking about the future of manufacturing. But what I want to talk about today is something that's on the positive side of what Foxconn's doing. And I think it points to possible new kinds of partnerships between very large industrial manufacturers like Foxconn and very small-scale makers like the kinds of people you guys are and who we see around the fair. So Foxconn is the group that Sony and Apple and all the big players go to when they need to produce hundreds of thousands or even millions of units, and you need to build a new factory and hire 30,000 people to work in it in 3 months. Foxconn does that for you. Foxconn is the people who can fix a problem on the assembly line by hiring 3,000 new workers overnight to fix the problem and get products shipped so that they'll be on shelves in time for the holidays. And all of these kinds of capacities, which Foxconn has built up over the last 4 decades, have only been available to the big guys, to multinational corporations, until 1 month ago. Last month, Foxconn opened up an experimental factory in Beijing called Innocon, and they are opening their doors to makers. And they're basically saying, if you're a maker with a small startup hardware entrepreneur, you can go to Innocon. They'll give you workspace. They will give you access to their engineers to do everything from rapid prototyping, design, molding, Q&A, quality assurance testing, trial runs, and of course, ultimately production. And you'll have access. Let's see if I can get this right. Oh, I did push the wrong button. Let's see if I can get that. All right. You'll have access to their skilled operators. So you'll have machine operators to help you do the things. And basically what they're doing is, this is the first example that I can see anywhere in the world of a very large industrial manufacturer reconfiguring their tools, their processes, and their people to meet the needs of small-scale makers. So it's a really interesting experiment. And they're doing it, of course, because they want to build relationships with whoever the next Steve Jobs is going to be. And this is actually a mosaic on the wall of Innocon, which is made of iPhone cases, which are, of course, produced by Foxconn. So the question that I want to pose to my friends is, if you look out, let's imagine 2025, what if a lot of other very large industrial manufacturers, what if they too started making their expertise and their people and their machine processes and their supply chains available to small-scale makers? So what if you were a toy maker, a small-scale toy maker, and you could go to Mattel, and they would connect you with their product in their assembly line? What if you had a new idea for a drink or a snack, and you could go to Pepsi or Coke or Kraft, and maybe you could work with their flavor chemists, or you are designing bags, and you could go to Coach. So you start to get these. I guess I want to pose the question to Richard and Duleesha. What would manufacturing look like, and what would making look like in that kind of a world?
Yeah, from our perspective, there's a big gap between what you make in the ones and the hundreds and what you make in the tens of thousands, which is what the Foxconns and the big manufacturing guys do. And there's a whole middle ground that's being created that didn't exist before. So in the past, you couldn't make a few hundred things and get it to market in any economical fashion. And all of that you can do today because of platforms like Etsy that help you distribute, platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo that help you finance, platforms like ShopLocker that was just here before that help you create an e-commerce platform. So those platforms are bridging the gap so that even those things that are made in small numbers can actually get to the people who want it, who want to buy it. So you're connecting the long tails of supply and demand. Now the implications for big guys is like, where do they play? Their capacity is still in the capabilities and the very large manufacturing space. However, one of the big problems now is people who are very successful in running a Kickstarter thing are designing to build 100 or a few hundred, maybe even a few thousand. They're not they don't look forward enough to say like, wow, if this really does become a big hit, how would you manufacture it at the tens of thousands levels? And that's where the Foxcons and all the other big guys can come in and help to say, you actually have to retool it and think of it very differently. But it's one more piece in the puzzle that will help connect this landscape from maker to manufacturer and make it much smoother for anyone. For those who choose to go beyond doing a few thousand units, you'll now have the capacity to do so, I think.
I'm sort of shocked to a certain degree, but at the same time, there's this notion that I think that I'm not sure people will care, right? I think what it comes down to, I think at the end of the day, if you follow the usual quote of like, you put the tools of production in people's hands. I think what becomes interesting therefore is either whether you're in China or India or in the US, you get to make the choice whether you want to be seen as a maker or a manufacturer, and again, whether you're here just because you're here and you do stuff and you make things, or you want to turn that into a business. The difference is that if those tools exist and the marketplaces exist, you as an individual get to make the choice versus you never had the choice before. And so if you're in Shenzhen, you can make PCB boards overnight in hours, right? So the choice and your ability to do those things, but still you can't then sell them into a larger marketplace. So the difference for me is more a matter of like, I don't think most people will care. I think the question really will be, is there a collective consciousness that, oh shit, now we get to make a choice? I don't know, but I think it's really interesting, and that's the reason why I'm here, is because you ask yourself constantly, is like, so where do I get inspiration from? So as a designer, you're constantly in the mode of being curious about the world and looking for new ideas. And so, but once you've got them and you sort of reflect on it, whether you actually reflect on it as a maker, because you'll continue just making things, but it enables you to go, okay, do I want to do this seriously? What part of my life is the maker, and why am I doing this? And so as a person, you can kind of go back to the why am I doing it in the first place, and you at least get to make the choice as to whether you want to do it as a profession. Is it going to take over your life, or are you just going to actually, no, I'm super happy having a hobby. So. Oh, right, my go. So then, and actually I'm going to leave this picture up because I think the piece that I wanted to talk about is around geography. But not just around geography, but geography in relation to what I would call the market or marketplace, which is always a bit of a scary thing to talk about at the maker movement, because most people here are just here because they're celebrating making things. But as I think about the individual things that Duleesha talked about, the sort of individual small identity pieces, and then Lyn was talking about the sort of massive scale, those two, the thing that's in the middle of that for me is always, so what is the marketplace? What is the thing that's either, what's the demand side, what's pulling on those things, and what's pushing, what's the supply side? And so as a guy who's lived in China for 6 years and I've worked all over the world, I'm in that mode where the world itself is enormous, but it's getting much smaller. And so when I look at either the supply side, which is usually China, or it has been for the last 20 or 30 years, is we make things in places where there are cheaper labor. That's kind of going away, and the world's becoming much flatter. And if it becomes much flatter, then everyone's bias and where they came from is holding them back from where they are. So I wanted to run, not even an experiment, but a bit of audience participation. Let's see. Is it going forward?
You have to push that green.
This one. Okay, so a picture of two good-looking guys. I would like a show of hands as to who knows the guy on the left. Really big height, so I can see, because I'm kind of blind and deaf and stupid. Okay, and how many people know the guy on the right? Apart from the two kids over here. So it's Justin Bieber, right? The guy on the left is Justin Bieber, right? He has 65 million fans around the world on Facebook, right? The guy on the right is Jay Chou, right? He has about 5 million fans. But when I ask audiences in China or in Asia, do you know A and B? Everybody knows both, right? So this is not a beat on anyone, but the point being is that Asians in general at the moment are very optimistic about where they're going in the world, and they're very optimistic and they're very curious about the world. And so they're constantly looking for whatever the new things are, and they're beyond their borders. And so Asians in general, and I hate generalizing about races, but Asians in general know more about what's going on in the wider world than Western people do. They just do. That's just the fact. And so given that, as a maker or as a manufacturer, and whether you're seeing yourself on the supply side or the demand, so supply side as a manufacturer or maker, okay, there are 2/3 of the world's population live in Asia, and so as a potential maker, founder, your marketplace could be enormous if you think about India and China. And if you think of yourself as on the demand side, as someone buying things, again, the world's a much bigger place, and things don't have to come from those kinds of places. Because so the idea of geography sets into one thing, and then at the same time, if the world becomes so big, I'm also of the opinion that the world's changing so fast that actually individuals and small things can make sense of the world around it. And actually big corporations have a hard time doing that. And whether you're GE or a bunch of other people, you're having a hard time to make sense of what that looks like. And as you look at the speed and the growth of million-dollar businesses, there are about 38,000 million-dollar businesses with only one employee, right? And there are about 1.7 million businesses that have revenue of more than $100,000 a year, right? And so if you look at the sort of future of hands of manufacturing on a global scale are actually in the hands of individuals and small things, not in the hands of large things. And so as you think about the power of the collective of the maker movement, actually you kind of do have a big influence. And so for me it goes back to this point of, but you get to make the choices whether you want to be part of that, you want to influence it, or you want to step out and just go to Black Rock Desert. It's kind of whatever you want it to be. So the question for me with these guys is both on an identity front and from a scale point of view, what does geography have to do with this?
Well, at least for now, what you're seeing, and we had this whole question of whether you go to Shenzhen or not if you want to manufacture something. It comes down to where the knowledge exists. If you really want to get into deep component knowledge or how to put things together, you do need to go to Shenzhen at this point. But there are a lot of bridges that are connecting now, a lot of accelerators that are working both here and there, a lot of people going back and forth, where that information is going to be more available, and that'll shift things. And the second part is, at some point, we won't care. We will buy the components, but we'll do the assembly over here. So I think it's going to democratize. I don't think it'll matter as much in 10 years. There'll be more flows of knowledge, and there'll be assembly in every place is what I believe.
I don't know if we have time for one question. Anyone? Yeah. Great.
You suggested that Foxconn would be acting out of hope that they would be able to attract new business, but the other side of that equation is that they're acting out of fear because they see enormous numbers of boutique, small-scale assembly companies forming that are the little mammals going to eat the dinosaur. Is there any evidence of that? Are there any reports that would indicate that's the case?
That indicate that they are acting out of fear, or?
There are these startups.
Yes. So the Foxconn, the Inocon engineer's story is that 6 years ago they were visited by a guy named Lei Jun, who's the head of a company called Xiaomi in China, which is sort of the Apple of China, in that they produce a very high-end, very expensive, very nice phone. And Lei Jun came to in at Foxconn, and no one would see him. No one would take his calls. He was way too small scale for them. And then, then they discovered the maker movement, and they put two and two together, and they said that their people are exactly what Duleesha and Richard were saying. People can start very small and grow very quickly and do really big things. How do we find a way to make sure that we are connecting with the people who are doing that? So I think it is both a hope and also very much a fear.